On May 20th, 1921, U.S. President Warren G. Harding stood in the East Room of the White House with over 100 eminent scientists and politicians. In his hand was a key and a deed. The key matched the lock on the mahogany box at his side. In the box, shielded with thick walls of lead, was exactly 1 gram of the metal radium. The rare element had been extracted from over 500 tons of carnotite ore mined in Colorado by the Standard Chemical Company, using processes perfected a decade earlier at great cost. The box's recipient was the very scientist who had first isolated the element, Marie Sklodowska Curie. In his presentation of the gift, 100,000 times more valuable than gold, President Harding said, "I have been commissioned to present to you this little phial of radium. To you, we owe our knowledge and possession of it, and so to you we give it, confident that in your possession of it will be the means further to unveil the fascinating secrets of nature, to widen the field of useful knowledge, to alleviate the suffering among the children of man. Take it to use as your wisdom shall direct, and your purpose of service shall incline you. Be sure that we esteem it but a small earnest of the sentiments for which it stands. It betokens the affection of one great people for another. It will remind you of the love of a grateful people for yourself, and it will testify in the useful work to which you devote it, the reverence of mankind for one of its foremost benefactors and most beloved of women."
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a mini-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series number 2, A History of the Atom. Episode 11.1, Supplemental. Marie Curie. The process that led to the leaden box, filled with a treasure more mysterious and exotic than even the ancient King Midas could have imagined, had begun a year earlier with an interview. The American journalist Marie Mattingly Maloney had managed to secure an afternoon with France's most famous, and some would say infamous, scientist. Missy Maloney, as she was known, had managed to arrange an interview with the now reclusive Curie at her new institute at the University of Paris. In the process of the interview, the two women from very different backgrounds became close. When Maloney asked Curie if there was a way she could help, the 2-time Nobel Prize-winning scientist told her that she needed more radium for her work. The Radium Institute at the university had only 1 gram, and it was being used at all times in the treatment of cancer. To do further research, the institute needed more of the rare and fantastically expensive element. Maloney said that she would see what she could do, and upon returning to the United States, used her magazine and connections to raise not only the necessarily $100,000 for the mining and manufacturing of the material, but also an additional sum to help continue modernization and upgrading of the facilities at the Radium Institute at the University of Paris. The former came in the form of small contributions from thousands of women who read Missy's magazine, while the latter was financed through donations made by physicians throughout the United States, many of whom who had studied and trained at the Institute previously. To me, this is a remarkable story in many ways. That these two women, so different in so many ways, would strike up not just a friendship, but a collaboration that would move a nation striving for normalcy, as the saying at the time went, to give such a gift is just stunning. I wonder what they talked about in the interview. Of all the things that never made it into the few inches of column in Maloney's fashion magazine. That's the story I want to tell in this episode. In my reading and my research, I found a lot of vague, sometimes contradictory information about the early life of Maria Sklodowski. We know that she was born in Warsaw in 1867, and that by this time Warsaw was part of the larger Russian Empire, something the native Polish people weren't very happy about. They wanted the right to determine their own futures, and they didn't see that happening as part of another nation who had its own culture and way of doing things. As is very often the case in these situations, the Polish people grew restless and protested their case. The autocratic government of Tsarist Russia didn't care much for the ideas of self-determination, nor the sometimes violent rhetoric of the protests, and so they responded by restricting what freedoms there had been and by repressing Polish institutions. Schools were closed, Polish customs and language were outlawed, festivals were forbidden. This, of course, led to more strident protests, which brought harsher reprisals. Such was the world which Maria was born into and in which she grew up. Her parents were intellectuals and educators who were caught up in the cycle of protest and repression, and who struggled to find a place where they could have a life for themselves and their families. Her grandfather had been a professor of literature, and her father was a teacher of mathematics and physics. The Sklodowski family had lost most of its wealth and property, and poverty was an ever-present reality for Maria as she grew up. Nevertheless, she received a good education in both mathematics and science, often using equipment her father had taken with him when the laboratory instruction at the gymnasia he had taught at had been closed by the Russian authorities. Her early life is a bit easier to pin down. At age 10, she began attending a school for girls from which she graduated with a gold medal by age 16. However, at this point, it gets a good bit trickier to sort through the myriad changes that took place and the stories that have been told about those changes. Here's what I've been able to ascertain. In the period between 1883 and 1891, she was unable to attend a regular university, as they did not admit women. When she was in Warsaw during that time, she was enrolled in an underground college, known alternatively as the Flying or Floating University. This institution was one of those things that often springs up in a repressed population that seeks to preserve the cultural heritage and intellectual development of its people. In this case, the Flying University taught Polish after it had been outlawed and allowed women to participate in its classes. It would be a mistake, however, to think that Maria was able to attend regularly as a student of a traditional university, as might be the case today. Her life was too uncertain and too much in flux to do that. Due to the need to provide for her family, she spent about 2 years as a governess for the family of a Russian nobleman who was related to her father. During this time, she lived or visited in Warsaw as she could, but her schooling was put on hold. When, in 1889, her father was once again able to find reliable and solid employment, Maria was able to return to Warsaw on a more permanent basis and also find employment working as an assistant in a laboratory with the Museum of Industry and Agriculture in Warsaw. During this time, she continued to take classes at the Flying University, teach herself, and hone her scientific skills. Her sister had married and moved to Paris in that same year and had invited her to join them, but Maria declined the offer in order to save money for tuition. However, in 1891, she changed her mind. As part of the Flying University, Maria had become involved in more political activities, including writing bitter attacks against the Russian authorities in an underground student newspaper. When a number of her friends were arrested for sedition, she decided that she had better leave Warsaw before she was forced to become involved in the legal case against them. Taking her sister's offer, she moved to Paris and enrolled in classes at the University of Paris, also known as the Sorbonne. The difficulty was that Marie, as she was known in Paris, lacked a formal undergraduate learning experience. While she had taken somewhat equivalent courses in mathematics from her father and had some learning and training in chemistry and physics from her work in the Flying University and at the museum, she found that she was quite a ways behind her fellow students. In order to devote more time to her studies, she left the home of her sister, which was an hour away from the university, and rented a small apartment closer to her classes. The additional expense required her to place herself on a strict budget, but she was able to make ends meet, even if just barely. She devoted the extra time to catching up, and by 1893 had earned a master's degree in physics, and a year later, using a scholarship provided for Polish students, completed the coursework for a second master's degree, though there is some debate as to whether this was in chemistry or mathematics. During that year, she also received a grant to study the magnetic properties of steel, and so she began to look for a place in which to conduct this research. This was how she met the man who would become her husband, Marie Curie. Pierre was one of the foremost researchers in Paris in magnetism, and was also the director of laboratory instruction at the Municipal School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry. Through the intermediary work of a friend of both of theirs, he was able to find rudimentary space for her research at the school, and it was while she worked on the research for the grant that their relationship blossomed. When she finished her second master's degree in 1894, she returned to Warsaw for a time to decide whether to return to her family there or to continue her work in Paris and continue to work on a relationship with Pierre. During her time in Warsaw, Pierre wrote her a number of letters encouraging her to return and to finish her doctoral work. As she looked around Warsaw and at the opportunities available to her there, she realized she would never be allowed to pursue her love of science. Understanding that returning to Paris meant leaving her heritage and family behind, she nevertheless left Warsaw and returned to the laboratory at the institution where Pierre worked. Upon her return to France, she insisted Pierre write up as many years of fruitful research in magnetism and submit it as a doctoral dissertation. In 1895, he was awarded a Ph.D. and made professor at the municipal school. 4 months later, the two were married in a simple civil ceremony. As a cyclist, I find it charming that the two newlyweds honeymooned by touring through the countryside around Paris on bicycles they had bought with a wedding gift. In 1897, Marie finished her research on magnetism, and when the grant paid out the final award for the submitted results, she used the money to pay back that scholarship she had received for being a Polish student in Paris. That summer, she gave birth to their first child, Irene. In this time, Pierre's recently widowed father came to live with the couple, and what had been a somewhat solitary life became much busier. The new responsibilities called the Curies to focus their lives around family and work, which would remain the case for as long as the two lived. Once things settled a bit, Marie and Pierre decided it was time for her to work towards a doctorate. For her research, she decided to focus on Becquerel's discoveries with radioactive materials. Becquerel had heard of her skill and had suggested she take the project. As there was very little research that had been completed, Marie realized that getting started in this new field would require much less reading and would thus allow her to start on experimentation almost immediately. As I've already discussed the bulk of this work in the root episode for this, I will summarize here. Using Pierre's piezoelectric electroscope invention, Marie was able to confirm Becquerel's results and discover polonium and radium. In 1898, Pierre became so intrigued with her work that he dropped what he was doing to assist her. During this time, they worked with the Central Chemical Products Company, a firm that marketed Pierre's scientific instruments. Their colleague, André Debrunay, cleverly adapted their standard lab techniques into larger-scale industrial processes in order to separate the minute quantities of radioactive material from the 1-ton sample of pitchblende they had received as a grant from the Austrian government. It took 3 years to isolate both a polonium bismuth compound and 1/10 of a gram sample of radium chloride salt from the material. Both were wildly radioactive, hundreds of times more active than Becquerel's original uranium salts. In 1900, the Curies presented their samples and findings and published all of the processes they had developed in isolating the radium and polonium. They did this without establishing patents so that all scientists could work with the material and develop technology without fear of infringing on the Curies' intellectual property. This, however, did mean that they relinquished all rights to make money from the processes that they had developed, something that would make it hard to balance the budget when their further research demanded additional funding. The research had other costs as well. As the research progressed, Pierre was sick more and more often, and Marie lost 20 pounds. While some of this was due to the physical nature of the work of chemical separation of the mound of pitchblende, especially early on, many of the health concerns came from the exposure to radiation emitted by the samples. Both Marie and Pierre endured radiation burns that permanently scarred their fingertips. So strong was the activity of their samples that at night the shed they worked in was illuminated by the ghostly self-luminescence of the materials in the vials and flasks stored there. As word of their discovery slowly leaked out into the scientific community through word of mouth and publication, recognition of their academic accomplishments followed. Over the previous several years, Pierre had tried to find a more lucrative position to help fund his research, but for a number of years, his unorthodox educational path had, until now, blocked that. In 1902, the University of Geneva offered a professorship. Unwilling to allow one of their most brilliant researchers to leave, the scientific establishment of France finally acted and offered him a position at the University of Paris, teaching physics, chemistry, and natural sciences to medical students. In this role, Pierre would undertake his research investigating the effects of radiation on living organisms. This led not only to applications of the radium salts he and Marie were isolating, but also to the development of a new radium industry focused on developing and applying Curie's processing techniques on a truly industrial scale in order to supply the medical field with radioactive material. It was a collaboration that would benefit Pierre and Marie in that it provided positions for the students who came to work with them and additional material to study. During this time, Marie took her first teaching post at a school for the training of teachers. In this role, she established the first curriculum of laboratory instruction for women there, though it took her about a year to get the material to a level that was actually accessible to her students. In 1903, the awards and recognitions began to pour in. There was the Nobel Prize in Physics and the Royal Society's Davy Medal, among many others. While great honors, the recognition also came with the inherent bias in the scientific culture of the time against women. The original nomination for the Nobel left Marie's name off the award, and it was only through the effort of both Pierre and the Swedish mathematician Magnus Gösta Mittag-Leffler that her name was added. When the couple traveled to England to receive the Davy Medal, it was only Pierre who was allowed to present their work to the gathered dignitaries. Nevertheless, he went out of his way to mention Marie's specific contributions and independent work so that there would be no mistake that she was every bit a primary contributor in the research. With the award came fame and all the difficulty that it brings. For this very private couple, the hardest thing to deal with was the loss of privacy. The two of them and their children were constantly badgered and followed by the press, and now they had to receive a number of visitors. While Marie handled this better, Pierre deeply resented the intrusions, which exhausted him. Combined with the effects of the radiation, the introverted man slowly lost the will to do research. Only after the notoriety of the awards had worn off, and the press had found other targets to pursue, did Pierre once again find the energy and the spark to begin again in late 1905. By spring of 1906, Pierre was once again fully engaged in academic life when tragedy struck. In the course of a busy day of meetings and plannings, he was struck and killed by a horse-drawn carriage, leaving Marie a widow. While Marie was devastated by the death of the man whom she was joined to, both in heart and intellect, she responded by diving back into her research. Her refuge was the shed where they had worked together to unlock the secrets of matter and discover the elements no one had foreseen. The French government offered her a pension to support her and the children, but she rejected it, as she was determined to support herself. More shocking was the offer from the University of Paris of Pierre's professorship. It was unheard of to offer such a prestigious post to a woman, but in a rare for the time display of egalitarianism, the Sorbonne recognized her contributions with the offer. She accepted the position with the determination to make the laboratory and the program a lasting legacy to Pierre's memory. Still, there were those who claimed that while she had done great work, it had only happened under the brilliant guidance of her husband's intellect. She would, they said, fade away after a few years, and the offer of the university would be shown to have been foolish. When she took the stage to give her first lecture, she picked up almost exactly where Pierre had left off, and without even a mention of her loss, she delivered the lecture in a low, clear, dispassionate voice. It was as if she was, as one author wrote, the very personification of the spirit of science. In the audience that day were more than just the program's medical students, but dignitaries from the French Academy of Sciences and the British Royal Society. The President of France and his wife were in attendance, as were the King and Queen of Spain, all to pay honor to this small, determined woman. As she returned to her work, she focused on two things. The first was building the program, and the second was the isolation of radium. It had been suggested by Lord Kelvin in England that radium was not in fact a new element, but some other element with 5 helium atoms attached. Over the next 4 years, Marie worked hard to isolate radium as a metal, finally using a method similar to that of Davy and Faraday in running a large electric current through molten uranium chloride. The amalgam of radium that formed with the mercury electrode was then purified in 1910 when the mercury was boiled off in a silica tube filled with nitrogen under reduced pressure. In this piece of work were the whispers put to rest. This she had done without Pierre, and for the effort she would be awarded a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. This should have been a crowning moment in a brilliant career, but it was soon followed by disappointment and scandal. During this time, the French press, like in many other nations, found that it could sell more newspapers by focusing on scandal over news. As the saying goes, some things never change. In late 1910, Marie was nominated for a vacant place in the French Academy of Sciences. Also nominated was French physicist Edouard Branly, who missed out on receiving the Nobel Prize in telegraphy to Marconi. The French press took this as a slight to national prestige, and so when the election between he and the Polish-born Curie became known, the newspapers turned it into a huge affair. There were scurrilous accusations against Marie from right-wing newspapers that asserted that her Polish origins should disqualify her from the election. In the end, Marie was defeated by either 1 or 2 votes. More damaging were the revelations in late 1911 of Marie's relationship with physicist Paul Langevin. Langevin had been a student of Pierre's years earlier, and he and Marie had entered into a romantic relationship following Pierre's death. This relationship had happened while Langevin was married to a woman who did not share or even understand his passion for science. His wife resented the time and energy he had put into his work instead of his family, and the two became estranged. While Marie and Paul were away at the first Solvay conference with a number of Europe's most gifted physicists, Langevin's wife filed papers for separation, and the sensationalistic media became aware of the affair. Soon, letters were published that were purported to be between Paul and Marie, and the nationalistic elements in the media decided to portray Marie as a Jewish homewrecker. When she returned to Paris, Marie found her home surrounded by an angry mob, and when she was forced to spirit her daughters away and spend time in the homes of friends. It was during this time and this frenzy that Marie received the telegram that she had been awarded that Nobel Prize in Chemistry. In December of 1911, she traveled to Stockholm to receive the award, and in her speech, she was careful to outline her original contributions, while also crediting the work of Pierre, Ernest Rutherford, and others who had made their own original contributions in the field of radioactivity. However, the stress of the last year finally caught up with Marie in January of 1912. Suffering from severe depression, she checked herself into a private clinic under an assumed name and did everything she could to disappear from public view. For the next 12 months, she avoided the press and did not return to the lab, even spending time in England with a fellow woman physicist who was married to a scientist. In this environment, Marie was finally able to regain her equilibrium. After the press had moved on to some other new scandal, she was able to return to Paris, and though she would never again live in the house where the mob had gathered, in December she once again took up working on her research. In August of 1914, the Radium Institute was finally opened on the Rue Pierre Curie in the Latin Quarter of Paris. Unfortunately, it did so just as the world changed forever. In August of 1914, the German army rolled through Belgium and World War I began. On September 2nd, German artillery shells fell on Paris, and all of the young researchers of the Institute were drafted to help with the war effort. In response to the peril, Marie transported the Institute's supply of radium to Bordeaux and then returned to Paris. Upon arriving, she collected as much of the radiological equipment as she could, gathered a few vehicles, and issued a call to the young women of the city. Over the next 2 months, she learned everything she could about how to operate X-ray machines and maintain vehicles and drive a car, and taught it to her cadre of 150 workers, including her 17-year-old daughter, Irene. She raised money and resources from the wealthy acquaintances, and with the French government's permission, created 20 mobile X-ray installations that would be vital to the surgeons treating the wounded. In the battles of the Marne and Ypres, Marie's little corps set up and operated these X-ray machines in Army field hospitals to help surgeons save the lives of French and British soldiers wounded in the battles. When the German advance had been stopped and pushed back, Marie returned to Bordeaux and retrieved the Institute's radium. Over the next 4 years, she at the Institute, along with her corps, worked hard to save those brought with injuries. And when the war ended 4 years later, she rejoiced in that not only was the slaughter over, but that her Polish homeland was once again a free nation. In 1919, the Radium Institute finally opened, and she acted as an energetic promoter of its mission. It was in this role that she gave the interview to Missy Maloney that resulted in the trip to the United States. The trip was a difficult one for Marie, as the constant attention and publicity was exhausting for her. While she was showered with recognition, it all threatened to overwhelm her, and it was only through the assistance of her daughters, especially Irene, now a chemistry student at the Sorbonne, that she was able to navigate all the social customs and functions. Following the trip to America, she settled in to the work of turning the Radium Institute, later named the Curie Institute, into a world-class research facility. Her daughter Irene would earn a Ph.D. in chemistry and would do work at the Institute, for which she would receive a Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935. Over the next 15 years, researchers at the Institute would publish over 400 papers and discover the first case of artificial radioactivity in the work of Solomon Rosenblum, who made a major discovery in 1929 when his work with actinium, prepared by Marie Curie herself, helped confirm quantum theory. Over the course of her life, Marie had been exposed to enormous quantities of radiation due to her work. As she grew older, her health began to appreciably suffer on account of this. As a result, she took the lead in establishing guidelines on safety for workers in industrial settings and at the Institute. She also worked to establish a center of research in Warsaw, and it was in 1928 that she once again traveled to America to raise money for the purchase of radium to support that endeavor. Due to her poor health and frail condition, she was spared the whirlwind of her first tour, and it was President Herbert Hoover who presented her with the silver certificate to purchase the element in Belgium. In 1934, Marie was diagnosed with a form of anemia caused by the destruction of the bone marrow, most likely created by prolonged exposure to radiation. On July 4th of that year, Marie Curie passed away. She was buried with her husband in Paris. In 1995, both of their remains were reinterred in the Paris Pantheon, along with other great men and women of France. In his remarks at the reinterment, President François Mitterrand said, "By transferring these ashes of Pierre and Marie Curie into the sanctuary of our collective memory, France not only performs an act of recognition, it also affirms a faith in science, in research, in its respect for those who dedicate themselves to science, just as Pierre and Marie Curie dedicated their energies and their lives to science." There is, I think, a great deal more that could be said in this podcast about Marie Curie, and her remarkable life. Much of the information here comes from the biography written by our youngest daughter, Eve, and from the page dedicated to her at the American Institute of Physics website. In my research, I found myself grappling with the problem of not falling into writing an hagiography of this amazing woman. Marie Curie was, without question, a passionate and complex woman whose capacity for work was unmatched. One of the things that I fear in presenting this is that the picture that will come across is one of a woman obsessively devoted to her research. Sometimes, when we encounter a story like this, it's hard not to find oneself lacking in the comparison. To think, I could never do that, and thus reject a path. There's a story about the Catholic advocate of social justice, Dorothy Day, where the interview calls her a saint. Day is said to have reacted angrily by telling the interviewer not to marginalize her work in that way. The implication being that since the interviewer wasn't as gifted or talented or holy as Day, they were not required to participate in the type of work she was advocating. I would hope that you, my listeners, would not do the same thing as Day's interviewer in hearing Marie Curie's story. From what I've read, Marie was a person who was deeply engaged in all aspects of her life. Yes, she was a hard-working scientist and researcher, but she was also a loving and supporting wife and an involved mother who raised two brilliant daughters. She was politically active in both French and Polish affairs, the latter both before and after she immigrated to France. She overcame the biases and prejudices of her time through the undeniable correctness of her work and the generosity of her life. She also endured and eventually triumphed over tragedy and sadness and opposition and stood up for those whose voices weren't as strong as hers. In this, I see her as a tremendous role model for all of us. A little intimidating, perhaps, but someone who can inspire us to do great things. We may not be as brilliant as she was, but through hard work and perseverance, we can accomplish much. It is in this example that I find encouragement, and I hope you will as well. Until next time, full sails on you.